Please go ahead.
Okay. So we've admitted participants. I can't quite see it.
They are already in.
Okay, thank you. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ute Collier. I'm the Deputy Director of the Knowledge Policy and Finance Centre here in IRENA. Thanks a lot for joining us to what is the final webinar in the IRENA Virtual Knowledge Exchange series on renewables-based clean cooking. We kicked this off in April, and I'm sure a lot of you have joined us for at least one previous session, if not all of them. And the goal was to shed light on the role of the different renewables-based clean cooking solutions in achieving SDG 7 by 2030, as well as the climate goals by 2050. We began with a solutions deep dive focusing on bioethanol, which we organized in partnership with UNIDO and the Council on Ethanol Clean Cooking. Then we had a session on biodigesters convened in partnership with SNV. We looked at electric cooking with the MEX program, and finally also at solid biomass with practical action. You'll find the info on these sessions on our website. Through this series, we have had the opportunity to engage with over 400 experts and gather insights on the current status of the solutions and on the challenges and how to overcome them to scale up adoption. So in this final webinar, we hope to share messages which emerge from these deep dive sessions and also have a discussion on the urgent measures that are needed to accelerate the use of renewables-based clean cooking solutions. You're probably aware of the recently launched Tracking SDG 7 report, which offered another sobering reminder of the lack of progress on clean cooking access. The present levels of investment are extremely inadequate, so we still got a net growth in the number of people living without access to clean cooking solutions, especially, of course, in sub-Saharan Africa. This delayed action continues to pose a significant social, economic, and environmental cost, and of course, that's borne disproportionately by women and children. We do know that a mix of clean cooking solutions will be necessary to reach universal access, and that's why we wanted to look at all the different solutions. There is no magic bullet, of course, and the mix will vary from country to country. However, over the next decades to 2050, as outlined in IRENA's World Energy Transitions Outlook, we really need to accelerate the shift to renewable-based cooking solutions to align not only with SDG 7, but also the climate agenda and make sure no one is left behind. Today, like in all our other sessions, we have an excellent lineup of speakers and experts to discuss the findings of the sessions and how we take things forward. We're going to start with a short presentation on the key findings we sort of distilled and to share some insights with you, and then we'll move on from that to a panel discussion. So I now hand over to my colleague Divyam, who will present a few slides with the insights from the previous sessions. Thank you, Divyam.
Thank you, Ute. Can you confirm you can see my slide?
Yes. Thank
Perfect.
you.
Great. Thanks, Ute. So what we wanted to do was to try and share some of the insights and the messages that were coming out of the series that we've organized over the past few months, and hopefully that sets the stage for a discussion on the way forward with all our esteemed panelists. I think we're all familiar with the numbers, so I won't get into it, but on the macro level, The latest SDG 7 report tells us that we are not on track. 2.3 billion people still without access in 2021. 1.9 billion will still remain without access under business as usual by 2030. And at a regional level, I think some of the trends are rather alarming, with regions like Sub-Saharan Africa seeing absolute growth in the number of people living without clean cooking access. So that is something that requires attention at this point, especially given that we have about 5 years left to 2030. As Ute mentioned, I think there's also now agreement that there will not be any one-size-fits-all solution. It'll involve a mix of solutions, and I think that solution will vary at a country level, at a local level. But I think the recent IEA AFTB report gives us quite an interesting picture about what that mix might look like. Of course, the ratios will vary from context to context, but I think the macro message here really is that almost 56% of the people gaining access to clean cooking between now and 2030, about 56% of them will be from non-LPG solutions. So we're talking about biogas, we're talking about bioethanol, we're talking about improved stoves with solid biomass, we're talking about electricity. So really, it's a combination of solutions that will be required to achieve universal access by 2030. If we sort of push the boundary a little bit forward to 2050, again, we see that, through IRENA's work in the World Energy Transitions Outlook, that the building sector or the residential sector in particular will have to transition more towards electricity-based solutions. So electricity will dominate in the building sector. So I think what we're really looking at is a mix of clean cooking solutions to 2030, but then further evolves moving to 2050 in terms of being aligned with sort of just and inclusive energy transition. Given this mix, we thought the renewables-based solutions don't necessarily get the same level of attention that they should, at least when we talk about bioethanol, with a lot of exciting things happening now in East Africa, but also a lot of experience that has been garnered in South Asia and West Africa. Similarly, with biodigesters in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa through national programs and regional programs, and now with electric cooking as well. So we sort of set out to partner with different institutions to organize these deep dive webinars over the last 6 odd months, to sort of go a little bit more in depth on some of the current status of these solutions, but also some of the challenges and some of the actions that are needed to scale up adoption. If we sort of look at some of the cross-cutting, measures that are coming across, I think one of the main things is really around the need for integrated national clean cooking strategies that sort of holistically look at all the available solutions, are somehow able to put a target in terms of what role can those solutions play up to a certain time period within the national clean cooking strategy, and how that evolution happens. Kenya's been working on it, and Uganda has just kickstarted, and we'll hear about that as well. But a lot of stakeholders highlighted the importance of a strategy that kind of provides a starting point for all of the sector stakeholders to work together towards a common objective. To complement that, the need for an institution with the responsibility and the mandate to be able to support the implementation of that strategy, to be able to mobilize the financing and make sure the cross-sector coordination happens across the ministries. And again, at the Africa Climate Week, we learned about Kenya and also Sierra Leone opening up clean cooking units in the Office of the President. So those are sort of important steps in that direction. Once we have the strategy, a lot of the discussion was around, we also need sort of solution-specific policies. So the bioethanol sector, the electric cooking sector, the biodigester sector requires its own tailored strategies or policies or regulations or schemes, whatever we may call it, that address some of the peculiarities of those solutions to make sure that the markets can develop. Data and information gaps are still quite large in the sector that impact planning, decision making, but also design of consumer-oriented financing schemes, for instance, but also measuring the direct and indirect benefits. We heard from India's case where they've estimated that every dollar invested in their biodigester program yields $66 of direct and indirect benefits. So those metrics are something that are missing. Again, I think a lot of the messages that were continuously coming through was that it's not about the technologies and the economics. Clean cooking cannot be a techno-economic assessment. It has to be putting end user preferences and their local dishes and behavior patterns and gender roles at the center of these strategies rather than the technology at the center of it. There is a large financing gap, and we'll talk about it a little bit more at the enterprise level, at the consumer level, but also at the ecosystem level. And public financing has to be scaled up. In fact, the IEA AFTB report, which says that annually investment has to be scaled up to 8 billion by 2030. Almost half of that, they estimate, is supposed to be concessional capital. So public financing will have a big role. Carbon markets and broader impact financing, very exciting theme. I think it sort of came across very strongly in almost every solutions deep dive we had. But also at the same time, a lot of sort of call for improving methodologies and harmonizing methodologies for transparency, accountability, and more equitable benefits under the voluntary markets team. But also looking at how we can tap into, Article 6 and international climate financing flows for the clean cooking sectors within that. Also examples of monetizing verified co-benefits across multiple SDGs. So whether it's gender, whether it's black carbon, whether it's health, and how to sort of we build the evidence base around that to attract broader financing, but also leveraging digital monitoring and verification systems to make accountability stronger and cost lower. And another interesting sort of, not interesting, but a recurring theme was around sort of fiscal incentives and the need for long-term stability and predictability, and how sort of markets and affordability for consumers is strongly impacted by a changing fiscal regime for fuels and stoves and the broader cooking ecosystem. So just very quickly, sort of some of the specifics, when we sort of on the biogas, biodigester side, very strong emphasis on investing in market linkages for bioslurry and the infrastructure to process, store, and transport the same. In some instances, bioslurry is actually much more valuable, and it really improves the viability of projects combined with carbon revenues. The need to sort of tap into medium and large scale biodigesters as well, with separate guidelines looking at institutional uses. The need for sort of public financing institutions that go sort of beyond the fiscal incentives. So grants for early stage project development, consumer financing that usually includes either an upfront grant or an RBF or a sort of a debt product, which sort of, or a combination of the three. But also sort of revolving funds for enterprises where the viability gap is the challenge, but not necessarily with LPG displacement. So you don't really need grants, but you can actually just have revolving funds to just revolve that capital. A lot of discussion around sort of leveling the playing field for local SMEs with incubation support, but also supporting carbon market access through aggregation. So especially for smaller players, investing in awareness raising and really building the case for biodigesters tailored to national priorities. So that could be around the agriculture sector, reducing fertilizer imports or improving food security, supporting applied research and development to adapt these solutions to local conditions, especially with changing livestock keeping habits, strengthening the training around biodigesters, ecosystems, but also sort of deepening the supply chains to bring the solutions to the doorstep of consumers, whether it's through digital platforms or through partnerships with, for example, dairy development boards, etc. For bioethanol, again, very similar. So, dedicated bioethanol policy that really addresses the different delivery models that we're seeing here. So we are seeing enterprises that are vertically integrated, working on sort of farming the feedstock with, the distillery, and then producing the bioethanol and then distributing it at the same time. You also have distributors, but you also have refiners with offtake agreements with smallholder farmers. So really sort of defining a policy to take the sector forward in a holistic way. Offering long-term and stable investment frameworks. So, looking at 5-year, 10-year timeframes with a very stable policy outlook, with commitments from the private sector to really let the sector grow and support and maximize benefits locally. Also, particularly in a lot of contexts that we heard about in East Africa, but also West Africa, is that a lot of these markets actually depend on imports for the bioethanol. So really, how do we over time support local production to reduce those imports, mitigate foreign exchange risk, but also sort of engage smallholder farmers in that process? investing in awareness raising, strengthening standards and certification framework. Again, sort of complementing supply side financing measures with demand side measures to bridge the affordability gap. So funding is needed not just on the products and equipment. So a lot of public financing is also required on the market development aspect around it. So around marketing, around research and development on new feedstocks, logistics, transportations, but also broadly applies to all solutions that market distorting subsidies on traditional fuels probably need to be managed to a certain extent while ensuring value transition to cleaner fuels, but while you ensure that energy security is maintained for the consumers. Electric cooking, similar, so pilot projects to map adoption trends, what the economics of electric cooking are, how sort of incentives impact adoption and use, but also how stacking behavior sort of is impacted there. But more importantly, also offer visibility that as electric cooking scales up, what kind of generation and distribution side investments do we require for quality to maintain quality and reliability of supply, both on the on-grid side, but also on the off-grid side. In countries like Uganda, they've experimented with decooking tariffs, through partnerships with utilities, but also with regulators. There was a lot of emphasis on strengthening the supply chain and consumer access to the appliances itself through fiscal incentives, but also upfront cost financing schemes that could possibly be delivered through the utilities themselves. Supporting local assembly and manufacturing of equipments to reduce imports over time. Increasing, again, public financing outlay for market activation campaigns, awareness raising, addressing perception issues, but also knowledge creation. And finally, supporting technology innovation and also, again, through standards and testing. Finally, on solid biomass, I think something that was echoed quite strongly was that biomass is now often left out in the discussion, although solid biomass does have a role to play, at least even if as a transitionary fuel. There's a lot of discussion around setting tailored standards for clean cook stoves that are aligned with the ISO performance standards, but also the SMAP multi-tier frameworks. But here again, a word of caution that if countries are setting targets, let's say tier 4 plus or tier 3 plus, it has to be, and the funding is only allocated to those, we have to sort of consider the impacts of those transition on existing store products and whether the stoves actually exist that can meet those standards. We need to provide incentives to support those local enterprises and manufacturers of cook stoves to be able to meet those standards. And then a big challenge also is to provide the testing and the third-party certification facilities for those manufacturers to be able to state that those stoves meet those standards or not. A lot of interesting discussion also around sort of the co-benefits offered by some advanced solutions, so including gasifiers that can produce biochar for to improve soil fertility. I think another interesting point was really around sort of making sure that the fuel, the raw material for the solid biomass has to have a local recipe. So we have an idea of long-term visibility on the production cycle over time, but also sort of the distribution side. And really sort of increasing funding again for developing those supply chains and addressing some sustainability issues, particularly in the informal charcoal value chains. Strengthen enterprise financing, but again here capital is also needed for equipment. So it's not so much just about the distribution and the stoves themselves, but it's also the equipment at the fuel production side that needs to be financed. And finally, really around engaging community groups in stores production, maintenance, marketing, which can also be an opportunity to enable alternative income sources. So sorry for this rapid sort of overview of the discussions that we've had over these 4 webinars on these different solutions, but hopefully that sets the stage for the panel discussion moving forward. So thank you for that, and I now hand over the floor to Sophie, who's going to be moderating the panel discussion to take it forward from here.
Okay. Thank you very much, Divyam. Thank you, Ute, for the background and the summary of all the discussions that have gone on over the last the 4 sessions. And I think we'll just dive right in. We do have quite diverse representation in our panel. And what we will do is, as we call up each panelist, I think they'll just do a quick introduction, just give us a quick introduction of themselves. And then I will ask the questions I believe there is opportunity for people to send through questions, which if possible will be answered live. But for now, we do have set questions, and hopefully the questions that some of the attendees have will be addressed. Yeah. So the first person I will call upon is Justin Akumu. Justin, we have crossed paths, is from Uganda. Justin, if you could turn on your camera. Yeah, there you are. Just give us a quick introduction of yourself.
Yes, my name is Justine Akumu. I work with the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development as an energy officer. I am responsible for activities on clean cooking, that is regarding promotion of renewable energy cooking solutions, as well as, planning in terms of creating enabling policy, developing programs on clean cooking. So I'm happy to be here once again to share my insights regarding what we've done in Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. Now, Divyam in his summary highlighted the importance of integrated clean cooking strategies, and he indicated, I think, Uganda, either you are in the early stages of developing one or you've developed. Now, speaking from your government perspective, what are some of the challenges you have faced in developing the clean cooking strategy? And how do you navigate the process of coordination between the different ministries and institutions, given that some of the asks that are put forward that are a follow through on the strategies that are such as fiscal incentives require the intervention from the Ministry of Finance?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. Maybe just to give some background to it, we've had lots of programs, but very small scale clean cooking interventions that are often uncoordinated. And because of that, we actually had very little impact. The small scale nature of the activities would not even, after 5 years, you can't even see any proof of, such an intervention having existed in the first place. And also the fact that, clean cooking is cross-cutting. For instance, you find, as Divyam presented, you have, the livestock sector is being managed by the agriculture, ministry. The forestry sector provides us the firewood. You have the utilities that are, supporting the distribution and supply of electricity. Yes, and then you also have, oil and gas activities that are providing an opportunity for cooking with, LPG, and all these are being done by different institutions, and it's not coordinated. So it was important that we came together and developed an integrated, clean cooking strategy. We call it the UNICS, Uganda National Integrated Clean Cooking Strategy. And that was because, first of all, to bring everybody who has a role to play in clean cooking, be it the private sector, the associations, the ministries who all have a role to play in the clean cooking sector, the sub-national entities such as the districts and, even up to sub-counties to get involved in planning and ensuring that we have one plan, one agenda, one goal, and also to marry it with the national, planning and development program. For instance, at this point, we're developing our energy transition plan, which is looking at, transition, pathways for transitioning to clean cooking solutions. There's a very strong focus on that. We're also developing our long-term energy resource assessment plans, but again, those were being done by different departments. So what we are seeing, what this has actually provided as an opportunity is to bring everybody in one room to actually discuss and develop, the right strategies. And hopefully with better reporting, actually, we will actually be able to show, better results. Right now, our statistics show that our access to clean cooking solutions stands at about 6%. But I believe with with better coordinated platform, we'll be able to actually report better. A case in point is, for instance, we do not report the good work that is done, the stove projects that are done, the carbon projects, actually, we don't report that. And that's because they are normally reporting to the Ministry of Water and Environment, who is the NDA, who was the NDA on CDM. Most of these CDM projects would actually report directly. So from our side, we used not to do the reporting, but now we are seeing with this integrated, coordination, it will actually improve reporting, it will improve resource mobilization, but also, help highlight the role that different ministries play and how we can strengthen each other to ensure that, you know, we achieve the 50% ambitious target that we are looking at by 2030. Thank you.
Thank you for that perspective, Justine. Now, as you try and bring together all these players, because from what you're saying, you have very many people that you're trying to bring together to develop this strategy. Can you walk us through just one challenge you faced in trying to, you know, bring together all these different perspectives, sieve them, and then determine what goes into the strategy and what is left out?
Yes, I think it's, you know, the whole idea of trying to appreciate, you know, what to prioritize. For instance, on one hand, you have, you know, those promoting solid biomass saying, no, the priority should be with solid biomass. On the other hand, you know, you have you know, the resources that are available. For instance, government has dedicated resources, for instance, for one type of technology. So having to bring all those entities together and appreciate, you know, help everybody appreciate that we all have a role to play in delivering clean cooking access by 50%. And it's important that we have that integrated, you know, planning, you know, aspect. I must say it has been more. It hasn't been much of a challenge. It has actually been a lot of an opportunity because it helped us actually appreciate and bridge those gaps that were needed to actually, you know, work better. On one side, for instance, the Ministry of Water and Environment is promoting clean cooking for the purpose of conserving the environment. However, the standards, you know, the indicators are not tallying. On the ministry side, we are looking at, we need regulations that reduce the rate of harvesting of biomass. However, that is not within our mandate. Similarly, when it comes to the Ministry of Local Government that deals with the subnational, you know, entities like the districts, it is their mandate, and we did not have that, you know, that access to them. So we are seeing with this integrated, you know, approach to things, we actually, it's helping us, you know, improve the interlinkages and plan better. And I urge other countries, you know, to take that approach as well. We saw, actually, we were able to learn from Ghana and Kenya, and we saw, you know, the accelerated, you know, rate of clean cooking that has actually been achieved. And we also want to take the same step. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justine. Wishing you well, and we look forward to the output and to you sharing these lessons with other countries across the world to emulate you on that. Now I'll switch over to Esther. Esther, if you could just do a quick introduction of yourself, please.
Sure. Thank you, Sophie, and thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Esther. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Sistema Bio. We're a global biodigester company with offices in Latin America, East Africa, and India. We have prefabricated biodigesters that are very durable and scalable, which has enabled us to go from Mexico, where we started initially, all the way to India, and more to come.
Great. Thank you for that introduction, Esther. Now, looking at what one of the highlights from the webinar, it's about the importance of adapting clean cooking solutions to local context and preferences. And I think Sistema Bio has done this very well. And you've just spoken about the fact that Sistema Bio is present across 3 continents. Can you elaborate how the technology innovation process has unfolded along with integrating community preferences and concerns? Just walk us through how you married those two.
Yeah, it sounds intuitive and counterintuitive at the same time, but it's really been a core piece of what we do. And I think it really today is within our DNA, because our founding team back in 2010, when we started, are farmers. So they understand, as most of you may know, biogas is clean cooking fuel that is generated from animal waste. So our main target customers are farmers who own 2 to 3 cows or 5 to 6 pigs, but also larger farms that can use biogas for productive use of energy. In the case of Sistema Bio, our founding teams actually in every single country, every time we have replicated this, have been farmers. Our technicians are farmers. Even our country director today in Kenya is a farmer. So this is really a big focus for us because it means that they can really relate and understand the product needs of our customers. And this means that all of our products are designed to be extremely user-friendly and very low maintenance and durable. So this is really the first statement around who we are and how important this is to us. Also, we've always really focused on optimizing the design to make sure that we can provide very reliable emissions reductions. So on top of user-friendliness and durability, really focusing on this since our foundation in 2010. And what this really means is that we have a very bottom-up approach to product improvement. We have all of our sales agents and our technicians who participate in annual surveys on what do they see on the ground, what would they like to improve. And we've separated two teams. We have a team really focusing on research and development on other types of feedstock and new products, but we also have a product improvement team that is constantly iterating on our product with the feedback. And it's really important that those same teams don't stay isolated. They go to the field and they spend time with the customers. Every year, the manufacturing team goes to install a biodigester, and this is always a really exciting time for them to really stress test what they're doing in the factory and seeing how it impacts the technical teams on the ground, and it generates new ideas and improvements. So really keeping this closeness and this relationship with customers and farmers is what drives our innovation process.
Great. Thank you, Esther. And I'm glad to hear that you keep your customer at the heart of what you're doing. You're constantly engaging with them and finding how your solution is working. Now, when we think about government and other partners, what would you say has been the role of government in your journey thus far? And what would you ask of government as we think about maybe other public-private partnerships, as we look at other solutions? What would your advice be both to government and also to private sector players?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And I think so far the roles of governments have been pretty very important, but indirect. So we have, for example, when we started in Kenya, we were really impressed in 2017 by how strong the enabling environment was in Kenya, with import tariffs that were at 0% for biogas, other benefits such as VAT exemption. So the governments were playing a more systemic role, not in a direct partnership. What we've learned in India, where we work with the National Dairy Development Board, is that government-aligned organizations can play a very practical role in supporting us. And they are the liaison with the government, but also to hundreds of thousands of dairy farmers in the case of India. And this was really the first time that we had such a practical field-based partnership with such a large organization, and it really makes a difference in our ability to scale, our ability to attain speed in implementation, and as well national recognition. What is new at Systema Bio, and I'm really happy to share this here, is that we have officially now been approved as a private sector partner in an Article 6 partnership between the Swiss and the Malawi government. So this is a project that has now been approved under Article 6 and is going to start in Q4 this year. And this is really where I see the future role of, or current and future role of governments, of really very actively getting involved in emission reduction markets, defining bilateral agreements, setting up partnerships, defining prices for carbon, defining the verification mechanisms. And this is really something where we see that governments can have a very, very big impact on scaling and facilitating clean cooking solutions, like the Swiss government did with the Malawi government in terms of offsetting the emissions from their oil imports through side agreements with Malawi and other countries. So there's a big role for governments in the global north to really regulate more on carbon and to define pricing structures, taxes that can really accelerate positive developments in the clean cooking sector.
Okay, congratulations on that
Yeah,
achievement. All the best, and we look forward to hearing more and more as you continue with your expansion plans.
Thanks.
So I will switch gears, and now after hearing from our private sector and government, I'll welcome Zijun Lee. Zijun, if you could just quickly just introduce yourself.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zijun Li, energy specialist with Energy Sector Assistance Program at the World Bank. I am co-leading the World Bank Clean Cooking Fund.
Okay. Thank you for that. So straight to the question now. One of the challenges that has been highlighted with regards to clean cooking and accelerating is how to channel public financing through to the last mile clean cooking enterprises and end users. And I believe World Bank has the Clean Cooking Fund, and you've deployed over $560 million US over the last 7 years to help towards tackling these challenges, both from the enterprise and end user side. Please speak to how that experience has been thus far and what changes, if any, you are going to effect going forward.
Thank you. So World Bank has a long history supporting the clean cooking and heating sector, and since actually back in 2015. So our clean cooking support portfolio has reached actually more than 590 million across more than 30 countries, targeting 43 million people with access to clean and improved cooking solutions. So the Clean Cooking Fund, it's a 500 million trust fund and was launched in 2019. It is so far the largest dedicated trust fund for spurring public political commitment. We try to scale up a public and the private investment, and also at the same time catalyzing innovation. So we are using RBF design and application to promote long-term sustainable market development. So in the past 5 years since the launch in 2015, the fund has provided 70 million co-financing to World Bank lending operation globally, and at the same time leverage over 150 million public and private financing. So a few focuses in the fund business model I want to share with everyone is first is its engagement at the national level to provide upstream technical support to establish enabling environment for private sector to come in, like quality standards and testing and all this upstream work. And the second is to really leverage the RBF, the resource-based financing grant, to support the hardest to reach market segment through improving their affordability of higher tier clean cooking solutions. For instance, in Rwanda, the fund is working with Ministry of Infrastructure to provide a pro-poor RBF scheme that target the low-income households specifically. So the fund is managed to leverage World Bank lending platform to provide access to finance for clean cooking enterprises, including using the credit lines, also microfinance for stove and fuel suppliers and end user, the households. And also we provide a suite of other risk mitigation instruments such as guarantee and collateral support to enhance their ability to access this upfront investment. Credit facilities and microfinance institutions, they play a key role like in promoting the adoption of clean cooking solutions. So the credit facilities I mentioned earlier, is they can provide the clean stove manufacturer and distribution companies working capital and also collateral. So, and then the microfinance can make the stoves more affordable to the households and to allow them to make installment payments, and having the ability to spread out the cost over time, right? For them to help them decide on like purchasing which kind of clean stoves. And I'll give you an example applying such a financing instrument is in the Ethiopia. We have a clean cooking energy program, which is a carbon finance project, which like aim to provide carbon revenue for household biodigesters. And the credit line component is under the World Bank lending operation. So that established a facility to provide private sector, enterprise, and household to develop market for like a set of technology, not only clean cooking, but also include like off-grid renewable energy products and services and others. So the Development Bank of Ethiopia, DBE, so it's the program's implementing agency. So they promote 2 lines of credit. So one is to support the working capital requirements for the clean cooking project developers. And the other is to provide on-lending support to the microfinance institution to make the off-grid renewable energy technologies, including the clean cooking, more affordable to the household. So yeah, so that's basically like is the one example like what we have done in the African continent. Then I will also maybe talk about like under the CCF, we are also like providing a suite of solutions to support the improvement of the cooking sector's enterprise ecosystem, in covering the key building blocks in the value chain. So in that sense, like we hope like more multilateral or regional development partners can adopt this concept and join force to scale up the financing and also innovation required for the sector. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Jijun. Given that we are talking just less than 7 years, yeah, and as you said, I think you disbursed 70 out of the 500. Is there something that can be done differently to sort of accelerate that uptake, especially amongst the MSMEs?
So 500 million is our funding envelope, is the target. So it's the target of the fund. So far, we are able to mobilize about like over 100 million from different donor and stakeholders. Yeah, so I think the approach under the fund is we really try to look into the ecosystem of the clean cooking sector itself and providing knowledge, not only the investment, but also the knowledge side. So in that sense, and we also try to work through the government, like together with the national governments, in a sense to design a program at the national scale and like helping them achieve their targets, like the national targets in a sense. And also we also work hard with the private sectors and also try to monetize the additional co-benefits from clean cooking investments beyond the GHG emission reductions and the carbon credits. For instance, I also like in Rwanda, we're also piloting like how to we're piloting a transaction on the co-benefits of health, adali, and gender, like for the overall like the national program I just mentioned in Rwanda. So.
Thank you for that additional context. Now, you've mentioned about carbon credits. Now, if we look at voluntary carbon markets, and I know Esther has alluded to this, I mean, for Hydro specifically in the compliance market, but if we look at specifically in the voluntary carbon market, what opportunities do you see for strengthening the voluntary carbon markets alongside Article 6.2 mechanisms? And what steps do you believe are needed to make them more accessible for clean cooking projects and programs?
Yeah, I think, thank you. So on that question, I think no one would disagree that carbon finance can boost the financial viability of the clean cooking projects. And the challenge for projects host country governments and also development partners is how to really harness this opportunity, at the same time manage its downside risks. So like with more funding we're seeing like coming from carbon finance, voluntary market flowing into the sector, I think we think governments need to carefully weigh the pros and cons for meeting their targets using carbon finance, meeting their target and energy access goals and NDC and targets. So the market regulatory ambiguity on and also the high price, right, in the past, and that we've seen having encouraged some companies to adopt this free stove distribution business model that rely fully on the carbon revenue. So, but we know that both economic theory and evidence confirm that the free stove distribution distort the market, right? So by really removing the customers' choices, and also you squeeze out the local producers in some way, and also constrain and limit the product innovation. So we think governments and also certification agencies, development partners, and private companies, we all have a role to play in mitigating this risk. Moving forward, for instance, governments, they should set up technical performance standards for the clean cooking technologies, and also require all projects, if possible, include those using the carbon finance to comply with these standards, and also strengthen the country's capacity in designing and authorizing, registering, or coordinating these carbon finance projects in some way, and also try to offer a framework to ensure carbon finance is aligned with its policy efforts to develop clean cooking solutions. Yeah, so that's on the government side. We think they have a bigger role to play, and then and other partners, as I mentioned, certification agencies, and they also should strengthen the transparency and also provide really related carbon credits, right? And certify responsible carbon credits in some way. Also provide guidance and procedure, and relate to the long-term sustainability. And development partners we can support governments to build capacity in all these aspects, in how to assess and how to manage carbon finance in some way. Also coordinate those incentive programs and interaction with carbon finance to really to provide a level playing field for all the private sector companies. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jijun. I think a lot of countries are right now in the final stages of either developing their carbon market regulations or even the policies. So it's quite useful to hear your perspective. And I know you need to leave us shortly. So thank you so much for your perspective and for your insights. I'll now switch gears to Jilin Konas-Belopolsky. If you could just introduce yourself, Jilin. Sorry, Jilin, you're still muted.
Oh, sorry, technical
No.
difficulties. Hi, everyone. I'm Jilin Connors-Belopolsky. I'm the Chief of Staff and External Affairs at the Clean Cooking Alliance, and we are a global organization that works with a network of partners really to build a robust clean cooking industry that's capable of delivering solutions to the nearly 3 billion people across the world who are currently living without.
Okay. Thank you for that, Jilin. Now, a recurring theme that has emerged has been the lack of political focus. And I think we've heard this repeatedly, that when governments and politicians are speaking about energy, they focus primarily on lighting or electricity, and less focus on clean cooking, in as much as they acknowledge it's a challenge. Given its intersectionality with climate, energy, health, and the wider development agenda, what immediate opportunities do you see for positioning the clean cooking agenda center stage in national and global discourse as a precursor to mobilizing the billions needed to move the needle on access rates.
Thanks, Sophie. And you're absolutely right. There is a tendency to, even when energy access is on the agenda, to equate energy access with electricity access. And I think we see from, the progress in both electricity and clean cooking that they don't necessarily equal each other. We're seeing fantastic progress in electrification, which is wonderful. But while we have about, 600, 700 million people technically without access to electricity, there's 2.3 billion people without access to clean cooking. So we know there's a gap there. And I think one of the other challenges is that clean cooking, when it is discussed, is often viewed as a technological transition. But as you were saying, it's more than that. It's a multidimensional challenge that intersects with health, environment, gender, poverty, and economic development. And really the first key to solving this challenge is political leadership. We know when presidents, prime ministers, and leaders create mechanisms within government, and Esther was talking about that enabling environment that supports the growth of an industry, they demonstrate that clean cooking is a national priority and that requires government-wide action, dedicated funding, and collaboration across all areas of the ecosystem. So, for example, having a delivery unit, which is one of the approaches that CCA is putting forth, ministries of energy and environment and health and gender and others can be brought together to build rigorous clean cooking frameworks. They can progress against national targets that can be tracked and reported. Policies can be refined to encourage more private sector investment, and clean cooking can be embedded into national climate, health, gender equality, and development agendas in a more whole of government approach. And we're seeing that governments are increasingly recognizing clean cooking as an energy and climate and development issue that's been left behind for too long. And they want to change that narrative. And they're starting to see delivery units as an opportunity to tackle the issue in a transformative and targeted way. So earlier this month, we were really pleased at the Africa Climate Summit that the government of Kenya announced the first clean cooking delivery unit, which will be a team of experts embedded in the office of the president. And so the emphasis will be on unlocking private sector capital and carbon finance to deliver Kenya's ambitious climate and clean energy goals. And the delivery unit will be housed at that highest level of government. And so we're really pleased that Sierra Leone quickly followed suit, announcing that they are also prepared to join Kenya with its own delivery unit. And several other African presidential offices are now in discussion to join what we're calling the Delivery Units Network, which will offer the technical support, capacity building, and the funding to support national-led clean cooking transitions. But with strong government leadership in place, we also need real system-wide partnerships to drive implementation. We have to start mainstreaming clean cooking into broader agendas. It cannot be done in isolation. It cannot be seen as its own sort of technological issue to address, but rather including it into broader agendas like climate, nature, food systems, sustainable cities, and encouraging a paradigm shift in approach that's built around much more holistic and systems level partnerships that bring together the whole set of diverse stakeholders. And I think, Esther is talking about how bringing in, the dairy farmers and the coalition, connecting clean cooking with agriculture and food systems. And we need to make sure that we're addressing all parts of these development, energy, climate issues. And we know that clean cooking initiatives require significant resources, both from funding, technical expertise, and infrastructure. So these types of cross-cutting and collaborative partnerships really allow for the pooling of resources, for rapid innovation and knowledge sharing across the ecosystem. And systems level partnerships can create the sense of collective responsibility and provide a framework for long-term collaboration. It won't be easy to sort of pass the buck to, it's this ministry that's supposed to do this, or that agency that's supposed to do that, or we have to push it all on the private sector or the public sector. We can ensure that these collaborations are enshrined in the fabric of all of these agendas, and that the initiatives are not short-lived. And I think essentially the success also depends on the inclusion and participation of diverse voices. So especially youth, women, and Indigenous communities who are really on the front lines of the climate and energy crisis and should be benefiting the most from all of these solutions and require their participation. So one example of where we're trying to bring this to life is also at the Africa Climate Summit. CCA announced the launch of a new African Conservation and Clean Cooking Collective, together with the African Wildlife Foundation and the African Development Bank, to drive a much more comprehensive and coordinated and African-led approach to both wildlife conservation, landscape restoration, and clean cooking, trying to bring together at a much larger scale these types of partners who can address some of the region's most pressing climate, environmental, health, gender issues through clean cooking.
Thank you so much, Jeline, and congratulations. I think it's quite an achievement to get a delivery unit anchored at the presidency. That speaks to the elevation of clean cooking and the priority that it's being given. So we definitely look forward to that being implemented in those two countries and the other countries as well. Now, increasingly, when you speak about clean cooking, you're talking about MSMEs and really, really local enterprises. And I think repeatedly, you get to hear about challenges in funding, and also challenges in expertise. We've had what has been spoken about by Jijun about World Bank funding, but sometimes that does not always trickle down all the way to localities. So from your perspective, what sort of financing opportunities would there be available to local enterprises, and how do we upskill individuals at the local level to be able to play within clean cooking, either in terms of production of clean cook stoves, production of fuel, whatever fuel is needed, but also skills required in the carbon markets?
Yeah, it's certainly true that the level of funding and investment in clean cooking has not matched the global magnitude of the challenge. And while it has increased in years, the sector still receives less than 5% of the estimated $10 billion per year required to achieve universal access by 2030. And even the new investment is concentrated in a narrowing set of companies. So less than 10 companies are actually responsible for raising more than 90% of the total investment in the clean cooking sector. So we need to find ways to make sure that investment is trickling down. As amazing as those 10 companies are, we're talking about 3 billion people across the world that need to be served. So we need many more enterprises, and we need greater amounts of capital to flow into the sector. And we need that capital to come from a much wider pool of investors with varying appetites for risk and return. We rely a lot on public finance and a handful of major investors who are already turned on to clean cooking. So grants, for example, are one way to benefit early stage clean cooking companies, helping them test their product and market fit and other early stage requirements. But grants historically only make up 15% of total investment. So they're not doing it either. It was one of the reasons that last year the Spark Plus Africa Fund assembled a very diverse group of investors from both public and private sectors to launch the first $70 million impact fund focused on investing in scalable next generation clean cooking companies in sub-Saharan Africa. And the fund's portfolio seeks to benefit from multiple sources of complementary technical assistance as well through partners like CCA and others to make sure that we're building a pipeline of investable companies that are able to serve multiple markets and consumer bases. But of course, one fund is not enough, and we need more than grants to really build a robust clean cooking sector. And we heard from Zilun that innovative finance sources have the ability to catalyze significant growth and funding and investment in the sector. And we've started to discuss how carbon finance, for instance, allows companies to lower consumer prices by aligning the cost of clean cooking solutions with consumer purchasing power. And this really helps businesses achieve scale economies and viability more quickly, and enables them to become appealing to traditional banks and investors. And carbon finance absolutely has the ability to completely alter the clean cooking ecosystem, but only if carbon finance cooking projects demonstrate really high levels of integrity, transparency, and accountability. So CCA is working with many of you on this call through our Responsible Carbon Finance Initiative to develop the necessary tools that will support a fair and credible niche for clean cooking within the carbon markets and really dramatically enhancing access to clean cooking solutions. Carbon finance is one of the only ways at the moment to ensure that we can get that type of financing to small companies, early stage companies that are serving, a really diverse set of markets and customers, and ensure that those benefits trickle down to the users and the people that really need it the most. Beyond the carbon finance sort of initiative and setting the principles and being really clear on the methodologies and baselines and trying to drive innovation through the carbon markets themselves, CCA is also launching a venture accelerator to help build the capacity of early stage clean cooking enterprises to secure carbon finance as a means of growth capital. We know that the transaction costs for registering projects and applying can be very, very high and are often out of reach for smaller companies. So trying to use this accelerator and see how we can reduce those transaction costs, provide the support and support a pipeline of early stage companies, and really targeting locally owned and women-led businesses as well to make sure that we're promoting and supporting diversity within the clean cooking sector. And this accelerator will help enhance the visibility of these businesses to carbon project developers, to intermediaries and buyers, and address gaps that often hinder the development of carbon projects. And I think these efforts link to one of CCA's other new efforts, our partnership platform for clean cooking finance that we launched together with the African Guarantee Fund and the United Nations Capital Development Fund that seeks to mobilize $100 million for clean cooking by 2026. And this platform is trying to bring together a range of ecosystem players from across both the carbon and clean cooking markets to continue to de-risk and crowd in even more investment in the sector. So we need those de-risking mechanisms alongside the carbon finance. But I think as Jillian was mentioning on the other types of results-based finance, clean cooking isn't solely a climate issue and does have profound social, health, and economic benefits. And so broader outcomes-based finance can supplement carbon and traditional funding programs and appeal to those investors who are looking to achieve strong social co-benefits, such as women's empowerment and economic development and public health gains. And so the one last example I'll land on where I think there's enormous potential is through the gender lens investment community. Gender lens investors around the world have committed more than $20 billion to achieving global gender outcomes, and transformative initiatives like 2X Global are trying to mobilize even more from a wide range of capital providers. So focusing on some of the other co-benefits like women's empowerment and gender equality really offers an incredible opportunity to unlock capital for clean cooking, which sits at that nexus of gender, health, and climate. And so in all shapes and forms, whatever they're coming in, it really is time to scale up both public and private investments to deliver clean cooking solutions in every household. I mean, that's how we reach our climate goals, we empower women, and keep our families healthy.
Great. Thank you so much, Jillian. I think there's quite a lot on your plate, on CCA's plate. We wish you well, and we look forward to hearing the success stories, I think, of all these initiatives. I think we all stand to benefit. And yeah, I'm sure IRENA will be looking to tell the story of how that has worked. I'll now pivot over to Caroline Ochieng. Caroline, welcome. If you could just introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you, Sophie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Caroline Ochieng. I'm a clean cooking finance specialist at AC for All. I've been working in clean cooking 6 months at AC for All, and then with different organizations previously. So 14 years to 15 on the same issue. Yes, thank you.
Great. That I think, yeah, you, as you said, you've been in this space for quite a while. So I think you're well versed with the challenges that we face, all stakeholders face. Now, specifically, climate and wider impact finance is seen as an important source of capital for the clean cooking sector. And I think we've had this both as highlighted from the World Bank perspective, but also from what Jillian has spoken to. And private sector is seeking to tap into this primarily through carbon markets. How can governments most effectively tap into climate financing for national programs and at scale to move the needle on clean cooking access?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. And the advantage of coming towards the end is my fellow panelists have given very good points on the same as well. But yes, I fully agree. I mean, if based on the estimates, we need 8 billion a year to 2030 to achieve universal access. We are barely at 100 million a year. So climate finance is definitely one of the avenues, but including all the other sources of finance as well. And then to your question, so how can governments tap into this? So certainly there's what private sector is doing, and it's positive, but of course not yet much in terms of climate finance. So as was said previously, we have very few companies that concentrated in very few settings, and therefore doing fairly not that massive scale of activities, even linked with climate finance. So with the government, then we have the potential of achieving scale. But then I think one of the key challenges is, and also opportunity would be in terms of prioritization. So for government to then be able to tap fully into climate finance or any other source of financing, whether it's equity, debt, including that which they raise locally, there needs to be a very clear ambition on what they want to achieve in clean cooking. And then this needs to go beyond these big statements that you'll hear in these conferences and summits and so on. But to actually see clean cooking, for instance, being part of national budget with clear funding allocation. If there's a shortfall, there's clear fundraising. And then this then would tackle all these challenges we see, like the World Bank was talking of Clean Cooking Fund. Part of it is to make countries prioritize clean cooking, because traditionally, when they are seeking finance for energy, the focus is on electrification. So if we had that priority, then even with climate finance, whether it's from GCF and not necessarily just carbon credit, then clean cooking will be strongly presented as one of the offers and one of the solutions for mitigating climate change, and therefore attracting that financing in the scale that it's required.
Yeah.
But then also, yes, okay.
Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to also add the point in terms of, so when we are looking at governments tapping into climate finance, again, it needs to be perceived not necessarily in terms of government doing projects, for instance, that attract carbon financing, but putting in place an enabling environment for those type of projects. So, for instance, defining clearly what's the role of the government versus what's the role of private sector when it comes to tapping into this source of finance. So carbon finance, for instance, will clearly provide finance that can help private sector, but this does not support at the stage where they are starting to develop the project. So it needs a different kind of financing. And that's where the government could come in to then help private sector de-risk the investments and also give that early phase capital that they will then be able to get back through climate finance when the results have been achieved.
Yeah. I think that's great input, Caroline. Now, in one or two sentences, I know one of the things that keeps coming up is specifically around enabling environment, is for governments to extend fiscal incentives. Yeah. What would you advise the government to do when they get these asks from private sector in terms of extending fiscal incentives?
Yes, yeah, that's an interesting one. So I think governments do recognize like the role fiscal incentives play in helping households to afford and access clean cooking. And that's why for years you've had, for instance, subsidies on kerosene. We still do have a lot of government subsidizing LPG, for instance. We don't have so much that when it comes to renewable energy side. And despite, of course, the lessons, for instance, of the harmful effects from, say, subsidizing kerosene, which was then being used, blended and then used for vehicles, and then not really meeting what it was meant to do. But then, yes, when it comes to advising, I think there's still some of those bad history that may still be in the minds of government that needs to be allayed, but also clarified how you avoid them. Because I've been in various discussions with governments when you talk of, for instance, say removing VAT or removing import tax for stove parts. One of their concern is how do we guarantee these metal sheets that are coming in are actually going to make stoves and not going to be diverted to something else. So they don't have in place systems to be able to track this all the way to guarantee that it's not going to be misused. But at the same time, the private sector itself could also have different interests. So you sort of need to even bring this private sector together so that their interests are aligned when doing this kind of, say, negotiation on tax. Because among private sector, there are those who would be importing final finished products. There are those importing parts. There are those with the factories, for instance, in a country that's producing finished products, who would then argue, then isn't it harmful for us? Or, I mean, why shouldn't we be getting better treatment because we are here local creating jobs and so on, versus somebody bringing in something? So some coordination among private sector, whether it's in the form of association that makes this argument, but also then the intergovernmental, intersectoral coordination within the government as well. Treasury will not understand why, for instance, probably why cook stoves should be tax-free. So it needs to be part of broader negotiation and maybe part of this broader integrated energy planning and with strategy and so forth, to then make it not something a role for one or two private sectors taking up, but it's clear that clean cooking is part of a national strategy, and to be able to achieve it, the solutions need to be affordable. And one of the ways is, for instance, to reduce tax. Then that would make it more likely to happen.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that perspective, Caroline. I think, as you've highlighted, every stakeholder has a role to play. I don't think you can expect success without all players stepping up and playing their role. I will advise the panelists, please also look at the Q&A. And if a question, if you can answer a question, please do go ahead. I'll now call upon Monojit Pal. Please, if you could introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay. Good afternoon, Monojit Pal. I'm a manager with the bank's, the African Development Bank's Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency team, also with the focus on clean cooking. Clean cooking is something relatively new in the bank. I think I'd say we've sort of begun looking at this space in the last 5 years. So a shorter history than for instance, with the World Bank. And I think as we, sorry, let me, that was a quick introduction. I can take
no, it's
any
okay.
questions.
I think you can give, it's good to give that background, which will then lead to the question around the Spark Plus fund. I think if you can just give us some background to that and your experience with that and what you're planning going forward. Okay, so I think I was going to say that, you know, when we began looking at this space 5 years ago, we very quickly realized that I think we were quite limited. I think this is a sort of a point that came up, and you raised it, Sophie, in terms of the sort of MSME sort of heavy sort of characteristic of the sector, that we would be quite limited in being able to approach or deal with most of the companies. And this is where we realized that we needed some kind of an intermediated structure. And that's when we reached out to the Clean Cooking Alliance. It was, I think, about 5 years, you know, I think it was early 2018, to say, look, can we do something together? Because I think, you know, we recognized that we didn't really understand the sector, but we've quickly understood that our ability to engage directly would be limited. And that's how the sort of journey for the Spark Plus Fund began. I think it's been a long journey to sort of get it up and running. So it's been running since about a year, a little over a year now. It's the you know, sort of began at about $40 million.
And as Gillian said, I think it's what's interesting about the Spark Plus fund is it brings together a very interesting mix of investors. I mean, we were pleasantly surprised. We wanted it, but I think we were very pleased to see institutional investors, sort of pension funds, coming in. I mean, not with very large numbers, but small numbers, because I think that's. But it sort of speaks to the way the fund is structured, that there is significant first loss capital, which is where I think the African Development Bank is an anchor investor using special funds, and also sort of other entities such as the European Commission sort of came in. So and we're still sort of seeing how we can sort of expand that structure as we speak to try and bring in more capital. So the fund is it closed last week at about $64 million, and might sort of, we're hoping to see that it hits the sort of 70 million mark. And I think that's a lot of money compared to what's gone to the sector, but a fraction of what's required still. I think the Spark Plus is quite interesting in terms of this portfolio that it has, that it covers, in terms of investments so far, there've been about half a dozen investments that sort of span from about $500,000 to about $5 or $6 million. So, and that is definitely not the range that makes sense for most MDBs to go in. So it's exactly where much of the opportunities are, and this is why we see Spark Plus sort of playing a key role in the entire ecosystem. And I think it also sort of buttresses other initiatives. For instance, there was talk of the Clean Cooking Fund, the results-based financing from the World Bank, and so one of the questions I think is with results-based financing, a lot of people have is, okay, how do you get to the point where you can actually draw the results-based financing? So these are mechanisms that sort of provide funding support, potentially provide funding support earlier in that sort of cycle and process. So I think we might see opportunities for I can't say collaboration, because it's sort of these are it's just how the market moves. But I think we discussed that with the World Bank, that that these approaches might come together in certain countries in some shape or form. So that's just in terms of, very quickly, in terms of the structure, in terms of the type of investments, but it's still very early days. I mean, this is 1 year. There are half a dozen investments. There'll be twice that number going ahead of the remaining sort of part of the investment period of the next 3 years. But the other thing I think we're also doing is, I think, so when we began looking at it, clean cooking separately, because I think we have a long tradition in the electricity sector, and so we began saying, what can we do separately? But we've also realized over time, I think, maybe 2 years ago, that look, we can't be running this as a standalone business, because we hit these constraints again of small project sizes, etc., and we need to sort of integrate also into the core business. So while we look at specific projects, we also look at integration into the core business, and by that I mean, into the electricity sector, for instance. And an example of this is a project we did in Somalia last year, where it was energy access with mini grids, and we included, at the request of the Somalis, included a small component on clean cooking. So relatively small project, but I think that's an example of what we're trying to achieve. And as we speak in Kenya, we've got with the Kenya Power Lighting Company, we've got what we're putting in place now is the third phase of the last mile access program. So it's a program with a lot of history, and we're sort of rolling that out. And in that context, sort of as an add-on, what we are thinking of doing is building on work that's been done by KPLC and Mix on electric cooking, and trying to see if we can integrate a small part to support of results-based financing to support maybe 30,000 electric pressure cookers or induction devices. So that's something that we're trying to put in place. We're trying to mobilize the funding for it, and it could be an add-on piece. But I think it speaks to this point around integrated planning and trying to, the points that I think were being raised on by the colleague from Uganda just now a little while ago. Another thing I'd like to just say is that in terms of other financing mechanisms, I think there was a lot of talk about carbon finance, and I think we are trying to also sort of see how we might be able to support entities on carbon finance. And I think we think there's a gap potentially in terms of sort of pre-financing expected credits, and with the idea that we are able to then sort of accelerate sort of rollouts. And this is something that I think many of the people on the call kind of know well. But so we're still at a relatively early stage, but hopefully by the end of the year or early next year, we're able to sort of close in on something. So we are having discussions on that front. It's still I would say on a trial or an experimental basis, and that we're using special resources for this as we plan, rather than sort of bank resources. But we think that this will lay the ground, could potentially lay the ground for using core bank resources as these activities scale up, because I think the needs are huge. So very quickly, so perspective on Spark Plus and sort of related sort of what, direct and indirect approaches. Happy to take questions or dive into anything else that you would like me to do.
Okay, thank you so much, Monojit. I love that AFDB is looking at this sector and is also innovating around it. I'm glad you're leading and you're showing the way to other banks as to the potential within the clean cooking sector. Last but not least, we'll come to Femi Oye. Femi, if you could just introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. My name is Femi Oye. So I'm based in Nigeria. I'm from Green Energy Biofuel. So I'm a clean technology investor. So we invest in biofuel types of cook stoves. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Femi. Now, speaking from the bioethanol side, and I think one of the challenges that has been raised is in terms of local supply of ethanol. What steps are needed? What steps need to be taken, and by whom specifically, to support and to increase the supply of ethanol locally?
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a very topical discussion around the industry. I would quickly want to establish first if everyone cook and we cook to eat and we cook our meal. So why do we find it and struggle so much to be able to mobilize the right kind of finance into this space to be able to catalyze it and ensure that we achieve this universal energy access? Our journey, of course, started over 15 years ago when we began to develop framework around releasing and getting into this space. We chose biofuel because we felt, not because it's the best or the only source, but because that is the one that resonates very well with us. And looking at the vast amount of materials and biomass resources that we have locally, both agricultural waste, cassava waste. I mean, the Nigeria happens to produce the largest volume of cassava, even in export. And then what do we do with all the wastes? We also have bagasse. We also have different forms of waste materials. So it wasn't the easiest choice to make to begin to investigate how we could get into cellulosic, converting biomass into ethanol. Why can't we just go into using sugar or using cassava to produce this type of ethanol? Before that time, Nigeria probably import about 99% of its ethanol. So there wasn't any local production that could support any serious company getting into cooking fuel. So most of the time when you look at the cost of importation is ridiculously expensive, and kerosene at that point in time was also subsidized by the government. So it was not just making any business sense. But it's changed today because we don't have the subsidy as we used to have anymore. And all of a sudden, it's becoming more viable. And of course, it's getting more interesting, getting to know also that bioethanol is now cheaper than kerosene, is cheaper than charcoal, is cheaper, even competing seriously with LPG. I think in Nigeria, if you can do your conversion, LPG per kg is getting into about 1,400 naira in about 2 months from today. And a liter of our ethanol is still sold over 800 naira in Nigeria. So there is a clear-cut economic and financial sense to it. So that was why I asked initially, why won't any investor want to put money in clean cooking business when we have millions of consumers that depend on it every day? Annually, over $5 billion is spent paying for one type of fuel or the other. So if we can just as a national focus for Nigeria, for example, and of course any other country could copy that, takes about 5% of this volume of energy getting into cooking to come from biofuel. Nigeria can effectively become a net export of cooking fuel even to other African countries. So these are our own proposition. And we've also seen from the industry over the years that we need some kind of remarketing or rebranding to the sector. So I've been long in this space. All I've grown up to understand is, how do we attract grants? How do we get support? How do we get aid? How do we get concessional financing to be able to develop the industry? I think that is not going to entice or convince any serious investor to come into that space. So for more than 8 years, I could not even raise the required finance to be able to build Africa's largest biorefinery. I got to a stage, every investor that I need to talk to, one question they will ask is that, what are you talking about? Clean cooking, how many people are in that sector? Can it really return good? Oh, it's too risky. So because everyone sees that space as a grant-heavy kind of sector, as a aid kind of sector, so we need to begin to look at how we can get investors that will ordinarily invest in gas, LNG, or any investor that will invest in large power projects to also begin to see the wealth that is actually locked in the clean cooking space. So talking about the value chain around it, how do we secure raw materials and feedstock locally to be able to support the upscaling of biofuel production in our local market? Africa predominant, we have a large, wide Arab land where we predominantly farmers. So that means that we'll constantly have to depend on this biomass to be able to cater for the energy that we also need to use to cook. So Africa will not have the issue with supply chain in terms of delivering enough biomass or enough feedstock. Either you call it sugarcane or cassava. But the other side that we need to look at is, how do we be able to brand the space and the industry to begin to appeal to the right types of investors? And that was what we did about 3 years ago, when we have to, because we did a vertical integration in our business model. So we have to separate production of the ethanol from the market side, where we have to distribute the cook stove itself. And everyday investors are knocking today, because we don't have to tell them about clean cook stoves. All we have to talk to them is, let's produce this energy. And we already have off-takers that can do that. And we can organize smallholder farmers. And of course, develop some programs whereby we can, government can invest in cluster and encourage small entrepreneurs, farmers, to identify where are those areas where investors have already invested into a biofuel plant. And we can pipe those supply chain towards supplying and guarantee what each plant is going to require every year. So these are some of those steps that we've taken in the past, and the numbers are growing today. We've done over 1 million cook stoves over this period, and the volume of ethanol being consumed now, used for cooking, is increasingly growing. And of course, we are seeing a sharp dip in the use of kerosene, and of course in other fossil fuel.
Okay. Thank you so much for your experience, Femi, and I believe it's something that can be replicated in other countries. Congratulations on those milestones. I believe now, in the interest of time, I'll hand it back to Divyam, but I'd like to say thank you very much to my panelists. I think we have received quite a number of insights and quite a number of announcements, and looking forward to what IRENA will have in store for us. Back to you, Divyam. Thank you.
Actually, back to me, Sophie. Thank you very
Back
much
to you.
for chairing this panel debate, which has been really interesting. And sadly, we have run out of time. So I'd like to thank all the panelists, and some of you have managed to answer some of the questions. There are a few we haven't been able to address, but please also check back on the previous seminars, webinars, which have addressed some of those questions already. So I'd also like to again thank all the partners who've helped us putting together this webinar series, which has been really insightful. And as Divyam has already shared, we have distilled some of the key findings, and we're currently working on a brief, which we will hopefully publish soon. So we'll let you all know when it's out, but of course, check our website as well. And there are various other initiatives where IRENA keeps engaging on the clean cooking front, and we hope to be doing more in the future. So thank you again for participating in this, and have a good evening. Bye.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Goodbye.